I've heard it said that when a person reaches the age of 50, they begin to ask different questions. Certainly, having been through transformative process by descent, around the age of 50, I was forced by life to ask larger questions, moved through an experience that took some repair, which saw the death of the personality and the direction that life seemed to be going in at that time, prior to that time. And there was a lot that needed changing and a lot that was good. Yet ultimately it was the descent itself that was the difficult feature of that movement through life. I might describe that as a kind of an ending, and I've talked elsewhere about the nature of endings and that we are given every day an opportunity to become coherent in the practice of letting go, or the nature of the season of the day as daylight turns to darkness, just as winters do, just as the moment becomes the next moment with no discernible line, because there really are no moments. But the energetic movement of being a human being, the apparent mind that attends to that sense of a moment, and there's just a fullness, a rollingness, a movement and a rest to being a human being experiencing a world of apparent relativity. And that stance that we each adopt and take as we begin, none of us really remember birthing, but soon there is a sense of I-ness, there's a space in which the I thought arises, in which mind arises, consciousness or awareness, whatever. But then there's a seeming sense of it, as I've said and say on most times I talk, there's a sense of being a person, seeing the world from this particular space and seeing other people in a world who appear to be, or we assume that they are seeing this same world from their particular space, and so it is. And then between this coming into the knowingness, the experiencing of this world, we live along a narrative line, we live along a timeline, and there are highs and there are lows. And ultimately we come to this experience that everything that precedes it seems to attempt to avoid, that we call dying and death. And from where I currently sit, it would seem that the exploration of that very ending and all of the energy that's gone into the preceding idea that I would rather that didn't happen, but if it is going to happen, I need to stamp meaning and purpose into the existence while I've got it, otherwise it's a wasted experience and it has no meaning. And what if that was the meaning that it has, there is no meaning? But that's not to say that there is meaningfulness to simply being, if we can uncover that thread, or if we can come to a place of recognition of that. Yet in this narrative movement and in this apparent timeline of time as a concept that we live along days and nights and seasons and weeks and years, there appears to be a constant invitation to practice letting go, to practice ending, to become coherent in the process of finally leaving this place. We can perhaps consider the idea, even if we have no empirical evidence, that there was a time when we didn't exist. I mean, with the application of time, we can certainly say we didn't exist. There was before I was born, one of the concepts that we have, because in the relative sense, we might like to say we're born, and there's a whole discussion around whether we're born and whether we die, and what is it that dies? What does die? The body and the mind seems to die. Consciousness, that locational consciousness that we appear to be as a person, as I say, this apparent perspective from this seeming vantage point. Perhaps, we don't know. We like to make up ideas about what might happen next. We have no basis or evidence for those ideas other than the triteness of belief and the necessity for hope in order to, and we use these in order to comfort ourselves while still here, that this impending ending should come along one day and spoil it all for us and the people that care about us. And we have a culture and an endemic cycle of having had this necessity to hope and this necessity to invent ideas about what might be next because there may have been a before. Yet, if we are truly empirical about it and we're honest with ourselves about it, which is perhaps if we search ourselves about that, we have no evidence for any of those things. But we would think that was bad news. We would hear that and think, well, that's dour, and it isn't initially good news. Yet, if we can come to the consideration of that, out of that consideration, what arises is the idea that, well, is it bad news, or is it just to embody the idea that this body and this mind will end and that this story will eventually be just a story for other people that seem to care or don't care, and that ultimately they'll be forgotten too, and then those who knew those that forgot this apparent story will be forgotten too, because in the end everything and everyone is forgotten. Or we might become characters in another narrative called history. Some do, few do, and arguably, how are we to really know that those stories are now any more accurate? Perhaps there may be, for a period at least, some way of tracing individual stories. This recording might be around for another year or two, or we just don't know what's going to happen. But that not knowing what's going to happen in the moment, in the hour, in the day, in the week, in the month, in the year, in the life, in the cycle, and so on, terrifies us. And nothing terrifies us more than the idea of dying and of being dead and of not being relevant anymore, of the meaninglessness, of the meaningfulness that I get to experience from this particular vantage point. That means nothing in the end. It becomes the emptiness that it may have come from, or may become the emptiness it may have come from. Now, in this narrative thread that I appear to have known, that I have known, I can see the appearance of this pattern of endings and the cycles and the places that it's taken me to. It's always been a descent into what we might initially call, and what is to be experienced as, difficulty, suffering, pain, even depression, brokenness, tragedy, misery, difficulty. I might have said difficulty twice, there has been a lot of it. And a life that when I describe it to other people, they say, oh, you've had a really hard time of it. I mean, but hard is relative and subjective. But the ways in which there's been seasons of these endings have appeared for me has been, the first one has really been the necessary absence, fall from, the ending of, the dying of, the grieving of, the death of innocence. As I've said elsewhere around this topic, there is that need to fall from the innocence of being a minor, of being a child, in which that necessary godlikeness, small g, of being the centre of the universe, being that self-centred, I don't mean that in a cynical way, small child that isn't afraid to ask questions of strangers, that isn't afraid to approach situations, that in fact all that stuff that we're learnt as we're conditioned, that gradually nullifies the innocence of the child. And also, we have experiences of difficulty, of being told off, or of going through terrible trauma, or of finding out that the world isn't essentially the safe place that a child would have it be, which is to learn how to filter and to modulate and to process and to begin to learn to read the other languages other than speech. Those are the languages of the body, sensing the environment, not walking down dark alleys and safe places. We have to come to a place where we die from that beautiful fecundity of innocence of the young child. Is such a joy to be around, because they are free, and that's not to negate the joy of that and the pleasure to the presence of that and the playfulness. But really, we would do well to keep a seed of that with us. But of course, like most things, we have to die to it, come to know the ending of it, grieve it, before we can begin to pick up and take with us, to transcend and include what was beneficial to us about that, and move forward and have some sense of that childlikeness. And often for many of us, that childishness that we carry too. Isn't that the case? And then, we learn how to use that and what works and what doesn't work. So there's a loss of innocence that was necessary. For me, that did come through traumatic experience, through the loss of a mother as a child, to come home from school and to be told that your mother died today at 2:30. Is an unholy experience, is a brutal experience. Now, those of you that wish to now get the opportunity to say, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you, fine, be sorry. But for me, and this is the gold, this is the gift that came out of it, is that 44 years later, I can call it a gift. Something so beautiful, because the embodiment and the owning of that and the learning that's come from that and the seed of that very terribleness, once fugued into the essence of who I appear to be in the moment, as every experience, regardless of labels we now call good and bad, comes with me and appears back with me right here, right now, has made me who I am. It's absolutely an experience that has made me who I am, that has defined a thread that's come with me. So, something that appears to be so difficult and painful and challenging, because it is. It's not pretty, and I'm not being glib about death and dying and suffering and difficulty and struggle and pain. It's awful. And when I am in pain, I'm in pain really badly. Give me the pain relief. Give me the medicine for the pain relief. I want it to go away. And part of that wanting difficulty, grief, suffering and death and pain to go away is the grief. We would rather it wasn't like that. We would rather literally take pain relief in order to not suffer at all and not fully experience the realness of that, the trauma of that. Not that I'm saying we should invite that stuff. I'm not making light of difficulty, but we as a culture, as a species, as a group and as a tribe, we have very neat ways of moving through that discomfort that we need to feel, that in so doing we lose the inherent and necessary teaching that rises out of that. Again, very clearly not saying that we shouldn't take pain relief, or that there isn't value in looking after ourselves as we go through that, but changing the narrative around it, which I'm somewhat attempting to do here, can be super helpful. And to have these discussions, to talk about this stuff, to embrace the challenge of being the human person, to try and understand, to try and comprehend, to try and know such experiences as loss and grief and suffering and difficulty and all that comes with it, and the fall, is to become coherent in the narrative of grief, is to become articulate around that thing that we try and avoid every day, that is present to us every day, reminding us, well, this is something you're going to go through. Nobody gets out alive, as Jim Morrison said so beautifully. And then there was the experience of becoming a teenager, so moving from the innocence of childhood to the loss of a parent and knowing trauma, coming home from school and not knowing what death was, but the one thing that came that very day to me, to our house, was that I knew I would not be seeing my mother again, who I had seen some weeks before previously. And my parents obviously knew that she was ill and she was going to die. But we didn't. This is to do with the time frame in history and the way in which my parents decided to parent, and that's okay. Yet I came home from school and I was very aware not only that I wouldn't be seeing her bodily again, but that what death was. And then there was the fall into the experience of that in the way in which we did it. So then I hit puberty, and there was the hormonal and physical changes that went through the dropping of the voice and all the usual accoutrements of hitting puberty. And then that very difficult, for me, riddled with difficulty and grief period of development where the body is, I think it's for the second time the body goes through more changes than it does at any other point, somewhere around 2 and somewhere in the early teen years. And trying to make sense of all that and having no mother around to help me make sense of it, having my father around who showed me how to make a form of masculine sense about that, was a death, and was for sure was the most challenging time I've been through, though it's hazy 44 years later. But so I theoretically look back and see how difficult that was without adequate support around me, without a support structure that was a source of pain relief, that did nurture, that did hold me there, that did also say, yeah, it's difficult and it's horrible that you're going through this. And there were kind words and coronets. It was a complex time and a difficult time, and much difficulty in working through that, and lots of therapy years later. Inevitably, we don't need a parent to die in order to end up in therapy, do we? We just need parents, arguably. And then there's the moving out into the world, into the workplace, and using the resources best as I had to discover that there weren't very good resources, and there was whole chunks of information and ways of being missing, and whole ways of doing things that I didn't have, and moving into my first place of my own, sharing with other people, not knowing how to do that, not knowing how to approach self-soothing with a way of being that was helpful. So I just abandoned myself to intoxication in the many ways that I could find, in as many ways as I could find. So that, again, there was no wisdom around for me to tap into that would have been able to say, yeah, this is difficult. There were my male friends, and of course I sought out introverts and deep thinkers and musicians and artists, because there's nothing more creative than loss and grief, and being in that place made perfect sense to me. So when I encountered and met other people that knew how to read those kind of languages, it felt like a home, it felt like safety. And artists and musicians and painters and creative peoples do know the language of more depth than the usual small talk that isn't a good facilitator at all, although can be a useful resource, to be around people that are bearing with and carrying with them infinite grief that's unresolved, and patterns and the difficulties and cycles that all come with that I had no way of comprehending. I just lived out of this pool of pain and difficulty and discomfort, and self-medicated on that naturally. That is grief. Complicated grief and uncomplicated grief are both grief. There is no rule book for it. There's no way of doing it well. They are both to be coherent in the languages of grief. Remember that. There's no time period, and there's no right way to do it, and there's no wrong way to do it. There is just it, and you're not doing it. And if we want to, we can become coherent in ways of doing it, or doing our best with it and without it on other days. So there was just a long period of all of that. And then the chemical conundrum, the substance misuse, became another way of dying. That became another loss. It became a primary relationship, the fundamental relationship I knew. And ultimately that took me to a place of death of the self, death of the programs for the first half of life, death of the person and the dreams and the hopes and all of that stuff death of the ideas given in childhood, in school, in the workplace that didn't really work, death of the idea of being some successful musician who would be discovered, identified and no longer invisible, something about lost mother energy there as well. Feeling invisible, why do we need to make ourselves visible? Why do we act out in ways which see us seeking for approval, esteem, definition through acting out, being the centre of attention, being the most fun at parties, and making sure that other people noticed us because we feel invisible. Why do people need to feel visible? Because they feel invisible. At some point, they've embodied or they've taken on board an experience where they were made to feel unimportant and irrelevant. And you can hear that in this biography here. But that said, that movement in my mid to late 30s, the death of the first half of life, I would call it, I was cared for. I was around people that had been through the same experience. I was nurtured. I was loved. I was treated with indifference where people were indifferent because they were working on their own stuff. But there was a lot of work done to me, and I was in community. I was in a new tribe. I was given a new design for living, and I was shown how to relatively navigate the world and begin to move out of the patterns for the first half of life and to do life, begin to see myself doing life well for the first time, begin to see myself making mistakes, the same mistakes I'd always made. Things hadn't changed. I was beginning to be changed. I was recovering at the time, moving towards an experience of having recovered for good and all, becoming a whole self, a whole sense of self, or the best version of myself I had been, which was enough at that time, and then there was more, and then there was more. I was learning how to do life on life's terms, taking each day as it comes. So there was yet another death, and I could see these were deaths. These were deaths of what was, or the cycle of birth and death was moving through me as the first half of life became the start of the second half of life. And moving through that and getting married and entering careers instead of jobs and entering the workplace and being promoted and being educated and really just starting again. It's why I say I discovered what I wanted to do when I left school at the age of 37, because that's when this new birth, the new seeds, the new buds, the new flowers, the new flourishing and the new sunshine and the new yellows of life began to appear and flourish for the first time. So there's all of this, and then I come up to the age of 50, and there's yet another death when I'm struck by a car on the pavement, and I go through the death of that sense of self, this spiritual person that I'd become, the seeker that I'd become, but I'm thrust into experience at the age of 50 akin to the experience my mother went through at the age of 41 that I came home to be told about. And now there was an enormous traverse through the terrain of dying and death at the age of 50, when these more serious questions can be asked of us. I ended up in a coma for a week, and I had to go through a period that I would call dark, that was full of light. The dark exists only in its relationship to the light. And so there was a movement through all of that, death obsession, confrontation with my own mortality, the realization in a therapeutic process that when I woke up in intensive care to be told, I was warm, not cold, to be told, you've been in an accident. And I said, yes, I can see something wrong. So I was tubed up and plugged in and beeping and switched on and in a basement and looking up at the clinical ceiling. To hear that statement that we'll all hear one day we'll all hear the richness of being told difficult statements that someone is ill, or that I am ill, that someone is no longer here, or whether young or old, just the again, the very fecundity of difficult and complicated experiences and notions and patterns and movements through time and endings that we'll have to go through to ultimately be told we're all going to die and that we are dying or that we will be dying, if we get the privilege of being told that, so that we can navigate that terrain and grieve well and die well even, which there is a way of doing. That doesn't mean necessarily that we need to medicate ourselves along the way, or that it isn't right to feel the pain, it isn't right to struggle with the experience, it isn't wrong to do those things either. It isn't wrong to suffer. It isn't wrong to struggle with it. It isn't wrong to want to put it to one side. It simply is as it comes. And it's an unfriendly ghost. But it's an inevitable dance that we'll go through. And out of that end of the spiritual seeking came the end of the spiritual seeking, became the embodiment of the idea of not being here one day, that I will die, that I am going to die, that an interest in this area has developed out of that, hence this talk, hence the other talks, hence the realization out of the end of spiritual seeking and the recognition of impermanence and the constant recognition of the patterns of that throughout life, and the understanding of the daily seasons, the momentary seasons, the lost expectations, the missedness, the constant grief, the petty death, la petite death, la petite mort, the small deaths of the everyday, the constant stream of endings, the loss of a mother as a child, the getting hit by a car at the age of 50, the end of the first half of life, seeing it all so clearly, wonderfully, desperately and dangerously, and wanting to articulate everything that's been articulated here and doing a not great job at it, but being, this is going to sound crazy, being excited by it. And of course, dying is going to be horrible. It's going to be awful. It's clear that it's going to be awful. But wanting to avoid the awful, is that not? Consider the idea that that might be even more awful. That the way in which we culturally, we come outside the room of the dying person in the ICU unit and we talk with the consultant and hide their own death from them, or maybe we want to hide our own death from the people that we care about. So just as I did when I went to see my mother and I'd gone there that day and she'd put her makeup on, despite looking reasonably emaciated and putting a wig on because she was having treatment for the illness that took her body and mind. We pretty ourselves up in order to negate somewhat the very unprettiness that we assume dying is. And of course it is unpretty because it's ugly. But in our avoidance of the ugliness of what we have to go through, we're avoiding the very essence of life itself, because life and death, dying, grieving, these are all part of the experience. And until we develop a healthier relationship and a more open relationship with them, or whilst we prohibit ourselves from doing so, then we remain incoherent in the language of loss and grief. Because there's nothing wrong with it. Dying isn't wrong. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with life. Right and wrong? Come on, let's try harder than that. Or let's know better than that. To be coherent in the language of grief is simply another way in which we're invited momentarily and enduringly to know absolute love in its fullest. And that's not to make glib of pain, but that is to embrace pain in a way which sees it transform us and sees it as transformative, rather than use pain as something to transmit and perpetuate generational cycles of the same fear and the same concern that life hurts and that it's bad that it hurts, because everything, capital E, belongs to good in the end. In the end, just as the loss of my mother did as a child. Peace be with you.